Thanks, Gitanjay, and good morning once again. So I have 15 minutes, and I have a long slide deck, so I'm going to get straight to work. Prateek has already taken us through problems related to access to data, and I want to just approach that same problem in a slightly different way. See that there is public access to court data, but this data is usually in an aggregate basis in the annual reports of various courts and tribunals. This is not really useful, at least for academic analysis and understanding of what are the institutional reform issues that we need to drive in these institutions. Ironically, there has been a big push for the release of data in all these institutions and tribunals and courts. But there is a strange tweak. It's very similar to what executive government is doing, which is that we are very interested in sharing user-friendly data, by which I mean a sort of consumer-centric release of data strategy. Oh, my litigant needs to know, my litigant needs to get SMSs about when their case is coming up. And this seems to be a big drive in this direction. And I think the upshot of what Prateek said and Surya mentioned about IT data is we need open access to data. These are public institutions run on taxpayer money. There is absolutely no reason why the public should not have access to all the data that is available in these institutions at the level of granularity that allows understanding. It's not just consumers and users of the system who need access to this data. It's every citizen of the country. Anyone who wants access to the data should be able to get it on standard APIs and data formats that anyone can use and analyze. This is a very big problem. There's only one way to get around it, and this paper relies on that strategy, which is that when courts or tribunals allow access, official access, then we get access to this granular data, and thanks to the chairman, the KAT, and the registrar and her team, we have got access to this data, which is why we can present this paper today. The paper does not focus on making some new theoretical claim or applying a new statistical model like Prateek is doing. It's much more preliminary. It's just 8 weeks in the making, so it still tells us interesting. It probably offers us some interesting new insights on what's going on in the tribunal. The first thing I want to say is that clearly there are many people in this room who've worked in the tribunal and on the tribunal far longer than I have, and I am most willing to learn and hope to hear back from you on the data that we present and ask us questions and provide us answers to the questions we have. So we said something about quantitative analysis. We also said something about evaluating tribunals. And I think this is important. That's the topic of this session. How do you evaluate tribunals? And one way of doing it is simply to take a tribunal to be a court. I think Prateek's doing that. You'll notice in my slides that we too do that. We essentially focus on the standard metrics of analyzing a court: disposal rates, filing rates, clearance rates, congestion rates, and so on and so forth. We can slap on other analytical and statistical models onto the analysis, but essentially we're looking at it as a court. This is a viable way of looking at tribunals, but maybe we should think about that question a little more carefully. Should they be looked at only as courts? The second option is what Mr. Arvind Jadhav spoke about at the end of the day yesterday. He said, why don't you look at tribunals not just as courts, but as institutions that are meant to reshape administrative practice? In that case, a good tribunal is a tribunal that makes for better administrative decision making. So really what we are not concerned, the primary model of analysis need not be just disposal rates. It can be substantive impact. Does it change the way revenue commissioners conduct land acquisition proceedings? This would make a difference. And this is a more substantive and yet quantitative model of analysis, and it doesn't treat the court merely as a tribunal. This is worth doing I don't think of I can't think of a single study that has done it, but maybe we should start thinking like that. I think yesterday, Gitanjoy in his presentation on the NGT tried to alert us to some of that, trying to look at the NGT and its impact on environmental decision making. And this might be a useful way of thinking about the question of how do you evaluate? What are the parameters? Having said that, in this presentation, I've stuck to a quote-based parameters model, and let me just share with you what we have found at the end of 8 weeks. I just need the clicker. So let's get started. So if you start with the, just a word, maybe I'll do my acknowledgements at the end. So let's just start with the overall statistics as reported by the Karnataka Appellate Tribunal. If you take a close look at that, this is the official records. I've not put 2016 on it. I got access to 2016 data 2 days ago, but the data does not change the trend. Notice two important things. First, that the rate of filing is decreasing. The rate of disposal is increasing. In 2016, the rate of filing continues to decrease rather precipitously down to something like just 1,500, 1,700 matters. And the rate of disposal increases up to 2015, but in 2016 it drops. And I say this with caution in two ways. If you break down the subject matter of filing, you notice that the drop is driven by the cooperatives cases. And there might be a simple doctrinal reason or a legislative amendment reason why the filing rate drops, but it's significant nevertheless. It may not be an overall indicator of demand for tribunal services, but insofar as we run successful institutions, the fact that citizens actually come to these institutions is some indicator of success. And we might want to think about why, while the overall disposal rate, sort of counterintuitive to what Pratik said, generally when disposal rates go up, filing rates go up. That is true, empirically true across most legal systems. But in the case of KAT, we see an increase in disposal rate and a decrease in filing rate. I'll leave it at that. I'll say a little more as we go along. So we can break this down and look at it by each year and look at the nature of the docket. And it's so small that I can barely read it, so maybe I turn back. So in the orange, you have revenue cases. In the yellow, I'll just call it yellow, cooperative cases, and green sales tax cases. And you notice that the docket is dominated by revenue and sales tax cases with a smaller number of cooperative cases. And the trend lines suggest that that is only accentuated with each passing year. If you look at disposals, you'll notice that cooperative disposals are extremely high. It might be a function of the lower docket size, or it might be a function of the nature of the matters. But generally speaking, you will see a higher range in the cooperative side. I'm going to rush through my slides a little bit. Be glad to share these slides with anyone who wants. Don't rush through the slides. So we look at two standard metrics for thinking about how any court-type institution is performing. We want to look at clearance rates and we want to look at congestion rates. Now these are measures which are, just to be clear, these are measures that are used in the academic legal literature on court analysis. I'm not going to suggest and defend any of these measures at the moment, but generally speaking, you're trying to increase your clearance rates and reduce your congestion rates. That's the kind of statistic that you're looking for. In the two bar graphs that you see up, we have broken it down by subject matter. And this is to Pratik's point that unless you break down a court's docket or a tribunal's docket carefully by subject matter, presenting aggregate statistics is not useful. Right? We want to know what kinds of cases, and really, you'll notice when I get to my last slides, even within sales tax cases, we want to know what kinds of sales tax cases show particular features of disposal rates, because it's only at that level of granularity that we can develop some predictive power. A second metric that we use in thinking about the usefulness, and here we're really talking about a tribunal, is to think in terms of its appeal and reversal rate, right? So essentially the view you can take, the sort of normative view you can take, is that an institution is a good institution when it decides cases quickly and those cases stay decided. If those cases are simply fodder and work through the chain of the appeal system or the review system and get reversed at higher levels, quick disposal rates are neither here nor there. What's important in a tribunal or a court's functioning is dispute settlement. The dispute should end. Now, measuring appeals and reversal rate in the High Court is very difficult for the Karnataka Appellate Tribunal, and there's a reason for this. There are three possible statistical data sets that we can work with. One is that the High Court calls for records from the KAT. When we look at the call for records data, it's abysmal. There are very, very few cases recorded it's less than 100 from what I remember. But that's clearly not all the cases that are going to the High Court. So we used another method, which is similar to what Surya spoke about. We went to the databases and looked at, we used a 3-year period, and we said if 2014 cases, X number of cases are decided in 2014, let's take 3 years and see how many of these cases end up being decided by the High Court. Remember, we took decided by the High Court, not filed before the High Court, because the High Court's database is not available to us. So we have no way of understanding how many KAT cases have been filed in the High Court. When we look at the disposal rate, the number of cases that go into the High Court and are decided by the High Court, the number looks like about 700, which is still a reasonably low rate. So if the measure of tribunal success is appeals, reviews, and reversals in the higher courts, we're not looking at reversal because we have not analyzed in the 700 cases how many cases have gone, has the court reversed the KAT decision. We have not done that analysis yet. But even if we take the appeal rate is less than 20%. And if that is the case, if this number is reliable, we need to validate it a little more. It's a good number to have for any tribunal or institution. So there is now we start opening up the some Pandora's boxes for thinking about how data gets generated, because you'll notice something quite stark in the graphs if you break them up year-wise. We studied 2 years. We studied 2014 and we studied 2016. The striking statistic that you get is that when we look at overall monthly filings, there seems to be a sort of December itch. In December, parties seem to decide that they need to come to the KAT. Now clearly, there's something wrong. There is nothing in the month of December that should lead to the increase in filings. So there's something going on in the recording practices in the tribunal that generate the statistic. As I work through the slides, you'll see that this is a persistent feature of the database maintained. I'm talking about paper registers that we have generated an electronic database from. Overall monthly disposal shows the same kind of number. And if we break it down by subject matter, the same thing. Revenue disposals, cooperative societies disposals, sales tax filings, sales tax disposals. So this is a remarkably resilient sort of number to suggest that there's something clearly in the way the tribunal works that December seems to be, November and December probably seem to be months of great activity. I'm sure there are good administrative explanations for this, but it would be interesting to hear them. So we've looked, what have we looked at so far? I'm moving into the 2016 database. My time's up. I'm going to take 5 more minutes to just talk about 2016. So in 2014, just to take you through the 2 years that we have studied, in 2014, we studied every case, every single case that came through the KAT. Every case that was filed, we tracked it through. In 2016, we developed a sample. What we changed our attention. We were not looking at filing rates and disposal rates and by court hall. We were very interested in looking in 2016 at case flow. Our focus was on, in 2016, if we look at the disposed cases, what kind of characteristics do they have? This is similar to some of the questions that Prateek was asking. So we used a sample set. We took the 3 main jurisdictions, and we took 6 cases from each jurisdiction. We randomized it across, every 2 months, taking cases across every 2 months. This is a standard randomization strategy to develop a sample. Many studies of courts around the world use the same randomization strategy. If there should be no particular difference to the first case disposed of each month. There should be no particular preference, rather, or bias. So the randomization the randomization strategy should work. As to what the sample size should be is a little bit that we can argue about. Should it be 18 cases? Should it be some other number? Is worth thinking about. We just went with 18 as much to optimize the time that we had on hand. The question that we wanted to ask very different in 2016. We didn't want to just look at appeal rates, and we didn't want to just look at filing rates and disposal rates. We wanted to look at the process. What do we learn about the process in the KAT when we look at disposed cases, most recently disposed cases? And arguably, we can say something about why some cases take more time than another. But I'm not going to venture in that direction today because I don't think we know enough. This tells us something about the randomization strategy. We also paid attention to court halls, so we randomized across the court halls in a consistent way. So I'm not going to take you through those details. Let's see what we find. In 2016, we find that, and I don't know if you're able to see, it's probably quite small. On the left-hand side, the bar graph on the left-hand side, the blue column are cases before 2010. In the orange column are cases between 2010 and 2013. And in the gray column are cases between 2013 and 2015. So of the cases disposed, the large majority of cases in our sample were recent cases. So this can be an indicator, a healthy indicator, in that why do we use the 3-year limit? For the same reason that Prateek used it, and the same reason that the Law Commission and the Supreme Court of India uses it. They have come up with a normative number that if cases are disposed within 3 years, they should not count in your delay statistics. So we just use 2013 to 15 as the number. So a good majority of cases disposed by the KAT in 2016 are cases that come within the 3-year limit. So that's one healthy sign. About what is it? It's more than 50%. When we break it down by subject matter type, we notice greater variation. So this is important. You notice that in some subject matters, the cases disposed are slightly older, and in other subject matters, the cases disposed are newer. And paying attention to this subject matter question is a really important way to try and understand delay. So I'm just going to run through my next 3 slides quickly. We then broke up the process time in each subject matter type case and averaged it across the cases that we sampled. And what we find is very interesting, that if you look on the right-hand side, if you want to, I'm just going to broadly describe this. you can look at the details later. But if you look at what's on the right, all of that happens before arguments. So the process that the case takes between your filing, curing of defects, your, just the case is simply not put up. There are all sorts of adjournments, early adjournments. In some cases, there are interim order phases and so on and so forth, or hearings, is more than 60% across the board. And if I move across the co-op and into sales tax, you start inching towards 70%. And this is what would be called, at least in British legal reform parlance, non-effective hearings. This is the kind of work that in Britain, in the Wolf reforms, were completely transferred as being registry functions. No court sitting in court ever did any of these things. Notice, issuing of notice, calling for records, that kind of time period, entirely pushed out of the courtroom into the registry process, given very tight time frames to get done. You'll notice that if we move into the revenue process, it is the worst. Of the three, between co-op and sales tax and revenue, it's a kind of an increasing scale. In the co-op cases, less time is used in the procedural formalities before any actual effective hearing takes place. It's more in the case of sales tax, and it's incredible in the case of the revenue department, because in some cases we found that more than 1,200 days had been spent before the records even showed up in court, and the case had been in the KT for a very long time. We also studied outcomes in this sample set. We wanted to study who wins. Is the state winning? Are private parties winning? Are the applicants winning or the respondents winning? And what's interesting here is that the number of cases that were dismissed, there's a very different win-loss statistic across the subject matter. And again, this requires further investigation and understanding. But simply put, the number of cases that more often than not, let me do overall, which is, no, I don't have an overall on this. On the revenue side, the number of cases that are allowed are higher than in any other subcategory of cases. And in the co-op cases, the number of cases where the person coming to the court loses is much higher than in the other cases. And this is something that we must think about. I think that's about the last slide. Yes. So let me just say one thing. I don't know if I get back to the beginning. So data work takes a lot of effort from various, yeah, thanks. I just wanted the opening slide. So this is no different. Three of our students, Aradhana, Harshal, and Sachin, helped code the data sets. Apurv helped at the early stage of putting it together. Amulya stayed with the study right to the slides that you see before you. This is very preliminary results. We need to deep dive into many of these questions and data numbers before we both understand them and offer deeper insight and solutions. So let me stop there and pass it back to Geetanja.